Dear students, in the previous classes we have discussed classical aggregate production function, classical theory of labor supply and labor demand. Now, having explained these ingredients to develop the classical model of employment and output determination, we are now in a position to explain determination of equilibrium level of income and employment in the classical model. So far, we have derived three relationships. The first is the aggregate production function written as y is equal to a into f of kl, aggregate production function. The demand for labor was written as function of real wage, supply of labor also a function of real wage, and demand for labor is negatively related to the real wage, and supply of labor is positively related to the real wage. These are the relationships we have derived so far in the previous classes. Now, these relationships, together with the equilibrium in the labor market, namely supply of labor is equal to demand for labor, determines equilibrium level of output, employment and real wage in the classical system. So, these three relationships together with the equilibrium in the labor market, that is supply of labor equals demand for labor, determines output, employment and real wage in the classical system. And output, employment and real wage, output, employment and real wage are the endogenous variables in the model, and these are the variables determined in the model. These are the variables output, employment and real wage are the endogenous variables in the model and as such determined in the model. Now, let us explain graphically the determination of this level of output, employment and real wage in the classical system. Now, as we have derived in the previous class, we have W by P and in W by P in the y-axis, L in the x-axis. This is demand for labor, and as we have discussed earlier, this demand for labor curve is nothing but the MBL curve. This is the supply of labor. Both are functions of real wage. So, demand for labor and supply of labor are functions of real wage due to the reasons we have explained in the previous class. Now, the equilibrium level of employment is LE. Equilibrium level of employment is LE and equilibrium level of real wage is W by PE. So, equilibrium level of employment and equilibrium level of real wage in the classical model is determined by the intersection between the supply curve of labor and demand curve of labor. Now, this equilibrium level of employment in the labor market determines equilibrium level of output in the product market. Equilibrium level of output where we consider y as equal to a f of KL, the aggregate production function, and equilibrium level of employment LE determines equilibrium level of output YE. So, equilibrium in the labor market determines equilibrium level of output. So, output is YE, employment is LE, and equilibrium real wage is W by PE. So, the aggregate production function together with the supply of labor, demand for labor, and the equilibrium condition in the labor market determines equilibrium level of employment, output, and real wage. Suppose that the real wage is lower, say W by P2. The real wage is W by P2. Now, as you can see, if it is lower, supply of labor is only X, demand for labor is Z. So, there is an excess demand for labor. Similarly, if the equilibrium wage is higher, W by P1, then there is an excess of supply of labor or demand for labor, GH. Demand for labor is only GH, supply of labor is only G, supply of labor is H. So, that is, if the equilibrium wage is lower than, if the real wage is lower than equilibrium wage, there is, as you can see, an excess demand for labor equal to XZ. As a result, and due to the assumption of flexible wages, money wages will rise. If W by P is W by P2, money wages will rise due to competitive bidding by the firms, due to competition between the firms to attract more laborers. As a result, W by PE will be restored. Similarly, if W by P is given by W by P1 higher than what is required for equilibrium, there is an excess supply of labor given by GH. Excess supply of labor given by GH. Here, competitive forces in the labor market ensures that the real wage will decrease to W by PE. Here there is competition between the workers to catch the scarce jobs. So, whether the real wage is above or below the equilibrium real wage, forces in the economy ensures equilibrium at W by PE. And the result is guaranteed in the classical model, as classical economists assumed that markets are perfectly competitive, prices are fully flexible, and there is perfect information. So, if there is perfect information, flexibility of prices and competitive markets as it is assumed in the classical model, this result is guaranteed. And the level of employment in the classical model determined by intersection between SL and DL is LE, and LE represents full employment. So equilibrium in the labor market in the classical model is equal to full employment, in the sense that all the members of the labor force who are willing to work at the real wage W by PE will be guaranteed a job in the labor market. So what classical result suggests is there is full employment in the labor market. But remember also this, classical full employment equilibrium is compatible with, consistent with frictional and voluntary unemployment. Frictional and voluntary unemployment. But classical full employment will not admit involuntary unemployment. So when the labor market is in equilibrium, there will be some frictional unemployment due to the frictions in the labor market explained by job search, etc. And there will be voluntary unemployment. A person is not willing to work, that is voluntary unemployment, but it will not admit involuntary unemployment. Anyone seeking to work will be provided with a job when the real wage is W by PE. Now, having discussed the determination of equilibrium level of employment, real wage and real income, now we explain how classical economics explains departure from full employment by real wage being unable to achieve equilibrium value due to institutional rigidities. That is, we explain how classical economists explain unemployment arising due to institutional rigidities which prevent real wage to be equal to W by PE. Suppose that due to some reasons W by P is equal to W by P1. That is, W by P, the real wage is higher than what is required for equilibrium in the labor market. Now, workers attracted by the high real wage will be willing to offer more employment given by point H. Whereas, due to high real wage, demand for labor from the part of the firms will be given by point S. So, if the real wage is greater than what is required to achieve full employment, there is an excess supply. This is based on the rule that the short side of the market prevail in equilibrium. And what is the short side? The short side is demand, because at a real wage equal to W by P1, the short side is demand for labor, the other side, the long side, is supply of labor. So we assume that in equilibrium, the short side dominates. So quantity of labor demanded will be equal to S, and quantity of labor supplied will also be equal to S. And the difference GH is known as excess supply of labor. So unemployment arises in the classical model if real wage is above equilibrium real wage. Unemployment arises in the classical model if real wage is above what is known as the equilibrium real wage. Stated differently, the classical theory of employment denies the existence of involuntary unemployment in the economy as long as wages are flexible. Classical theory denies existence of involuntary unemployment in the economy as long as real wages are flexible. So the point is, in the classical system, unemployment arises due to institutional rigidities. And the classical economists believed that if labor market is left to adjust its own, that is, if there is no interference in the working of the labor market, excess supply of labor drive the prices down. Prices here means wages down, and equilibrium will be restored. So unemployment GH is only temporary. In the classical model, automatic adjustment due to price flexibility in the labor market ensures restoration of equilibrium at full employment. There is no need for any intervention from the government. Now, as we have discussed, if the real wage is above W by PE, such as W by P1, due to institutional rigidities, then there will be unemployment in the labor market. As noted by classical economists of 1930s, it is possible that institutional causes could prolong this adjustment to equilibrium. Institutional rigidities could prolong adjustment to equilibrium real wage W by PE. One example is trade unions. One example is trade unions. Trade unions, due to their bargaining capacity, might prevent real wages from falling to ensure equilibrium. That is, trade union activities will prevent the real wages from falling from W by P1 to W by PE to ensure equilibrium at full employment. So, in this case, unemployment is considered as voluntary. A person, if he is not getting employment, it is voluntary unemployment because he can enter the labor force accepting a lower wage by refusing to become a union member. That is one reason for one case of institutional rigidity which prevents equilibrium. A second one is minimum wages. Minimum wages by the government. A second institutional rigidity discussed by the classical economists is minimum wages set by the government. Suppose that the government sets a wage equal to W by P1, then it is not possible to achieve full employment at W by PE. So, these two cases causes an excess, supply of labor or over demand for labor. Similarly, if W by P is lower by W by P2, there is an excess demand for labor, and this will be eliminated due to competitive bidding by entrepreneurs, by the firms. So, as long as the labor market and wage rates are flexible, if the economy is free from institutional rigidities caused by trade unions and minimum wages, full employment at equilibrium real wage will be established. And when the labor market is in equilibrium, there will be frictional and voluntary unemployment, but there will be no involuntary unemployment. Now, once equilibrium employment is determined in the labor market, equilibrium output, remember this, we are talking about aggregate output, Y is nothing but GDP. Y is nothing but GDP. Equilibrium output is determined given the availability of technology. That is, how productive is the workforce. Given the equilibrium in the labor market, equilibrium level of output is determined given the state of technology. And the state of technology determines the shape of production function. And in the figure, the production function determined by the state of technology is OY, which determines equilibrium level of output YE. And this YE is nothing but aggregate supply. YE constitutes aggregate supply. That is, equilibrium in the labor market combined with the classical aggregate production function determined by the state of technology determines equilibrium level of output. And this equilibrium level of output is what is known as aggregate supply. Now the question is, how do we know that this aggregate supply level is an equilibrium level? This aggregate supply level is an equilibrium level. Or stated differently, how did classical theory ensure that labor market equilibrium is consistent with the product market equilibrium? There is labor market equilibrium, and in which sense this is consistent with the product market equilibrium? Now, classical economists advanced two further theories to ensure that aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. They advanced two more theories to ensure that aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. One is the size law of market, which we have discussed in the previous class. And the law says that whatever is produced is automatically demanded. So if aggregate output or aggregate supply is given by YE, this will be equal to aggregate demand, due to the size law, which says that whatever is produced is automatically demanded. And according to the size law, the only reason to participate in production process, work is a bad commodity, so why a person participate in production process is to obtain income, and income to purchase goods and services. So it is, if it is not to spend money, it is irrational to participate in work, because work is a bad commodity. So whatever is produced is automatically demanded. Now, a problem arises here is, what happens if income is postponed for purchases at a later time, at a future time? And classical economists overcome this problem by stating that whatever is postponed, the income which is not spent will be invested. And what is the guarantee that demand to save is the decision to save is always equal to the decision to invest? This is a question which we will discuss later. So, as long as the decision to save is equal to the decision to invest, whatever is postponed will be invested and supply will be equal to demand. This answer to this question is given by the loanable fund theory. So, the second theory is the loanable fund theory, which states that whatever is supplied is demanded. So, classical economists advanced two theories to ensure that output, aggregate supply, is always equal to aggregate demand. One, the size law of markets. Second is the loanable fund theory, which says that whatever is supplied is automatically demanded. That is, in the capital market, movement in the rate of interest ensures that saving is always equal to investment. Saving is always equal to investment. So, saving is always equal to investment, and YE corresponds to full employment level of output. And this is the essence of classical theory of employment and output determination. The endogenous variables determined in the model are L, the amount of employment, real wage, and real income. Remember this, all these are real variables.